Augustine is seen as one of the great saints of the West, of the forefathers of the West. Augustine is seen as almost, for many, the pinnacle of the fathers. There are many within the West, when they think of St. Augustine, there are virtually no criticisms can be made of him. The way he has articulated faith theologically, exegetically, politically, ecclesially, liturgically, uh, he sums it up, the best and the brightest. And so, why would anyone criticize St. Augustine? It's Roman Catholic, it's Christian thought at its finest, its wisest, and its best. That's one position that some people take when it comes to Augustine. There are others who they read Augustine, they tend to just see the negative elements of Augustine's theology, whether it's election, whether it's double election, whether it's the city of God in terms of supporting an empire. And there's various ways you can read the city of God that seems to legitimate that. Was Augustine more Latin than he was Christian, or was he more Christian than he was Latin? These sort of questions. And so the other side, if we can see on the one hand Augustinian hagiography, there's others who see no good in Augustine in terms of his theology, his politics, his view of sexuality, the view of baptism, and a whole range of other particular issues. And so those are the two extreme views of Augustine, hagiography or demonization. Somewhere in the middle, there's obviously the wheat and tare approach, the sic et non, the yes and no approach to Augustine. Obviously, he was a brilliant genius, prolific. There is no Christian in the West, perhaps next to Augustine, who's written as much as Augustine. I might also add the great debates between Augustine and Pelagius. Some will lean much more in the Pelagian direction, others in the Augustinian direction. The issue of free will and grace is a part of that. Now, if you're a Pelagian, you're going to differ with Augustine on that. If you're a strong Augustinian, you're obviously going to see Pelagius. And one of the great sadnesses, certainly of the West, theologically, is the way Augustine has been idealized and Pelagius has been demonized. And I think a much more sound and deeper reading of Pelagius will reveal perhaps some of the blind spots, faults, and failings in Augustine's understanding of the free will grace issue. And so when we have to sort of reflect on the wheat and tares in Augustine's theologically, or with the Donatists, for example, you again get very different perspectives on how the Donatists are understood. If you read them through Augustine's eyes, that's one thing. If you read it through the Donatist eyes, quite different. And so, how do we approach Augustine? Hagiography, demonization, or weighing wheat and tares. The City of God is one of those great works, as I mentioned in the first presentation, that sums up theologically, through myths, some of the great myths of the Roman gods. Augustine unpacks that bit by bit. What's the great appeal? What's the dark side of that? What's the how do you critique the Roman gods and the way many of the Roman citizens understood that? Where were they just seen as myths that most people, he uses Varro and people like this, sees that, yeah, they're important, but you can't take them too serious. And if you take them too literally, it leads to really questionable behavior. But the first part of the City of God really enters into the mind of a Roman, and great Roman literature, Cicero, Seneca, Varro, many of the great Roman writers in which Roman thought at its best is portrayed, but also Roman thought at its worst is also unpacked. And so the City of God approaches the city of man, particularly the Roman one, looking what it means to be a Roman citizen at its noblest mess. And he gradually moves through the City of God to the City of God itself. And interesting enough, in the City of God, he doesn't talk about the Roman Catholic Church. It's just the City of God, and what is the nature of Christians who've compromised their faith, and what's the nature of authentic Christianity, both theologically and in lifestyle itself. And of the 22 books, Augustine also, in the early part, he looks at many of the Roman myths, and then he moves into the great philosophical tradition coming out of Plato and Plotinus and the Aeneids, and he brings together the richness of complex Christian exegesis, Christian theology, Christian politics, a biblical thought, because Augustine constantly is drawing from the mother lode of the Bible and attempting to articulate what all this means in the period of time he's living in, drawing from the wellspring of Christian theology and exegesis as well. Needless to say, there's been many comments on the city of God, as I mentioned in my first presentation. There are those on the political right, which will use Augustine for his view of just war, right-wing just war theory, the relationship of church and state in a closer alliance. There's others who are going to argue that Augustine is going to argue that if a person is a true adherent of the city of God, they will forever be suspicious of the city of man and what motivates that city of man: cupiditous, greed, imperial overstretch, egoism. And that can be masked behind political rhetoric, but nonetheless, there are motivations here that those from the city of God must be very wary of. And the middle position, of course, in interpreting the city of God is Christians live in time, they live in history. We do not live in eternity or in an ultimate sense. We live in a penultimate reality. So what then is our relationship as members of the city of God to the city of man in time and history? Do we uncritically genuflect towards the state? Do we take a prophetic attitude in critiquing the state when it is not true to its high calling? Because Augustine will argue in the city of God that in fact Rome had very high values in the Republic, and they increasingly thinned out, they withered as the empire came along, and it lost its golden age, as it were, the great vision which inspired Rome. And so where from those in the city of God can they in fact tap into the best of the city of man, or what we would call natural theology, in terms of what Paul will argue in Romans, that those who truly listen to their conscience, even though within that Jewish Christian tradition, not inspired by the Bible, but within the natural theology tradition, they can see many of the great virtues versus the vices, and natural law can teach people a great deal. So the city of God in that sense is constantly in this uneasy tension between wheat and tares in the city of God as we live in time and history, because we don't live in the perfection of eternity. We're not in the New Jerusalem. We're not in Eden. So we're somewhere between Eden and the New Jerusalem, which means even those in the city of God have mixed motives, as well as in the city of man. And there may be those within the city of man, in theory, in which the principles are held high, and in their lifestyle they live with integrity, and those in the city of God who in principle should be living with the noblest of aspirations, in fact, betray those aspirations again and again. So what can be the alliances between the city of God and the city of man, and where must there be a parting of paths between the two? And so throughout the 22 books of the city of God, Augustine is weighing again and again, where do we have alliances with as members of the city of God? And for example, when you have the Goths or the Visigoths, Vandals coming in, violence, raping, destruction of cities, who is going to protect the Christians? Do they all, would Augustine, as a bishop of Hippo, basically say, as Christ died on the cross, would not use violence, but would be willing to suffer violence rather than to enact it? That's all right for one person to say. You say that to thousands of people of a diocese? Or will Augustine argue under certain conditions, Christians must resort to violence to prevent a greater violence? And so these are the many issues going on in City God. Is theology done in a very practical, in the trenches manner, under historic conditions in which tragedy is dominating, in which you have violence being enacted, coming down through Italy, coming into northern Africa? And Augustine, as a bishop, has to think both theoretically and practically about the implications of how you interpret the Bible, church tradition, in a very tragic historic situation. Do you want to use, as a Latin, as a Christian, would he support imperialism? Obviously not. Is he a pacifist? Not under this situation. So what's the middle way he's grappling with in the city of God to say, well, how do I defend these women, these children, these families in my diocese and beyond? Because in one way he was looked up to as the preeminent bishop in the church at this time. He had encountered, struggled with many what were seen as heresies theologically. He engaged Jerome on a variety of exegetical differences. Now the issue was politically. What do I do as I see at that time would be seen as terrorism, invasion, violence, and I'm watching my own parishioners, the victims of this sort of stuff. And so City of God, it was written almost over 10 years, so this is not something that was coughed up in a millisecond. It's him grappling as he's watching historic conditions change. He's replying to critics of Rome who are blaming Christians for the fall of Rome, and he's trying to point out, no, in fact, Rome persisted. Now, whether the City of God should be read uncritically, I don't think we read any books uncritically. And in reading the City of God, to read it critically rather than devotionally has been the task really of centuries in terms of exegetes of the City of God. Next to the Bible, I assume in many ways, the great work of exegesis of the Bible and its application in the real world, in the West at least, is the City of God. So to claim to be Christian and not to internalize the City of God is not to be Christian in understanding Christianity in a significant or substantive sense. And the City of God is very, very much a thoughtful, grounded, philosophical, theological, exegetical, political way in interpreting the significance of the Bible for real historic moments, particularly of tragic historic moments, and how do we make sense of faith in such a context.